You've worked hard, you've saved carefully, you've raised really good kids, but what happens if the inheritance you leave them gets hijacked in a divorce, or eaten up by creditors, or wiped out by a lawsuit? My name is Chris McClure, and I help people answer that question all the time. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I work with folks worried about what happens when they leave their inheritance. You see, that's the blind spot that most families never see coming. And it's the reason I've watched decades of hard work vanish in ways no one even imagined. When an inheritance isn't structured the right way, it's like leaving the front door unlocked. Divorce attorneys can walk in, creditors can walk in, even accidents and lawsuits no one saw coming can reach straight in that door. Once wealth disappears, that's it. It's not coming back. But it doesn't have to be like that. Before we finish today, I'll show you how families lock down what they've built so it survives the storms. I think about a father who spent his whole adult life providing for his family. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't a gambler, he was just steady. And by the time his daughter was in her late 30s, he had built a nest egg far beyond anything his parents ever had. She was thriving too. She had a good job, she was married for more than a decade, she had kids, and she seemed really settled. And he decided to share some of what he'd built early, about $6 million put directly into her name. 3 years later, the marriage unraveled. The law in their state treated that gift as marital property, so half of it was gone in the divorce. Now let me be clear, he didn't come to me before making that gift. He only sat across from me after the divorce had already carved it up. If I had been working with him at the time, there are ways we could have handled it differently. Sometimes it's a trust, sometimes it's the way the gift is titled, sometimes it's even the timing. There's really no universal answer, but there are answers, and the difference is huge. With structure, that $6 million would have stayed protected. Without it, the door was wide open. I still remember him sitting in my office afterwards. He wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter, he was just worn down. He kind of rubbed the side of his temple like he had a headache that wouldn't lift. He tried to explain, he stopped halfway through a sentence, and finally just mattered, I never thought about this. It wasn't the money that broke him, it was realizing that decades of sacrifice, decades of hard work could be sliced apart by people who had nothing to do with building it. And it doesn't have to happen. Another family comes to mind. They owned this old brick building downtown. The grandfather bought it back in the 60s when everyone thought downtown was finished. Friends told him he was throwing money away. He didn't care. His son spent years keeping it alive, repainting it, fixing leaks, convincing tenants to stay. By the time the granddaughter Emily inherited it, the building was worth millions. But if you'd ask her about it, she wouldn't have talked about the value. She would have told you about running through the halls as a little girl, the smell of the stairwell after it rained, or the way her dad used to stop and say, "This is what your grandfather saw when no one else did." And then one winter morning, a tenant slipped on the ice out front. The lawsuit didn't just go after the building because it was titled in Emily's personal name. Every asset she owned was suddenly in play. By the time I met her, the lawsuit was already underway, and what struck me most was how something as simple as a title could have changed everything. That's why one of the very first things I look at with families is titling. Because the way an asset is held can be the difference between safety and exposure. For more than a year, unfortunately, she lived in fear. She told me she'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening for the furnace to kick on, wondering how it had come to this. And when the settlement came, unfortunately, it forced her to sell the property. Her father later sat across from me, and he was silent for about a minute. And he shook his head and said, "It feels like I lost my dad all over again." That's the part that sticks with me, not just the sale, but the sense that a piece of family history had been erased. And it didn't have to happen. And then there was Dr. Lewis. That wasn't his real name. He was a physician. He was a careful man. He practiced medicine for 35 years. And when he passed, he left $4 million split evenly between his son and daughter. Anna, his daughter, invested it conservatively, paid for her children's education, and built long-term security. And David, unfortunately, was reckless. He built a business partnership that collapsed, some lawsuits followed, and because his inheritance sat in his personal name, creditors had a clear path to it. Within 2 years, it was gone. And that contrast, it still sits with me. 2 kids, same father, same values, raised the same way, but only one kept what he left them. Not because of their choices, because of how the inheritance was structured. And this isn't unusual. It happens more often than most families might realize. But the good news is that it's preventable. The families I meet with worry endlessly about estate taxes. And I get it, taxes are obvious. They're on the headline and every lawyer brings them up. But in the 3 decades I've been working, I rarely see taxes destroy a family's legacy. Divorce does, lawsuits do, and creditors do. And like I said earlier, once it's gone, there's no strategy to bring it back. And there is a way to protect against it, and it doesn't mean locking your money away from your kids. Think of it like wrapping a protective wrapper around them, and that you're leaving it in an appropriate protective shell. They still have the keys, they can open the shell when they need to, they can use it, they can invest it, they can even manage it themselves. But legally, the trust, it's a shell, but it's the trust that owns the assets, not just them personally. You see, that one layer change, that one layer of trust changes everything. If the marriage falls apart, it isn't divided. If creditors come knocking, they can't touch it. If a remarriage fails years later, the new spouse has no claim. You see, the legacy, it still stays intact. It stays in your bloodline. And really, it's not about controlling your children after you're gone. It's about protecting what you built from people who had nothing to do with creating it. The families who take this step all share the same instinct. They've worked too hard for too long to see their legacy carved up in someone else's legal battle. So if you built something meaningful and you want to be sure it doesn't just transfer but actually survives, maybe it's worth us having a conversation. Because like I said, once wealth disappears in a divorce or a lawsuit, there isn't a plan to bring it back. But there are ways to keep this from happening. So if you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe. Every week I share strategies that families can use to protect their wealth and legacy. And if you want to chat, feel free to click on the link below to schedule a call. I really do love making these videos, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.